Look at the boots by your door. In 1955, a farmer bought one pair like that and wore them for 20 years. Not 20 months, 20 years. Resoled 3 or 4 times, the uppers going darker and softer every season, the shape of his own foot pressed into them until nobody else could have worn them comfortably. When he finally set them aside, it was not because they failed, it was because he did. Now be honest about yours. If you bought them in the last 3 years, you have already watched them start to go. The leather across the flex point has gone pale and stiff. There is a crease that is turning into a crack. The sole is separating along one edge, just a little, just enough that you have started thinking about the next pair. And here is what I want you to understand before we go one sentence further. Those boots are not wearing out. Almost nothing you have done in them has hurt them. The damage is happening at night in your house while you sleep, and it takes about 12 hours. I grew up around men who owned one good pair of boots and treated them like a piece of equipment because that is what they were. There was a bench inside the back door of that farmhouse with a can on the shelf above it, and every man who came through that door had a routine that took him about 90 seconds and that he never once skipped. Not when he was tired, not when it was late, not when the boots were coming right back on at 4 in the morning. 90 seconds, that was the whole trick, and almost none of it was what people think it was. By the end of this, you will know what leather actually is and why it fails, which is not what you have been told. You will know the one place in your house you must never put a wet boot, and I would bet money that is exactly where you put them last. You will know the 4 things people rub into leather that quietly destroy it, and you will know the single detail on the side of a boot that tells you before you spend $1 whether that boot can live 20 years or whether it was built to die. Stay with me because the second part is the whole thing. Here is the reframe, and it is going to sound wrong at first. Boots do not wear out. Boots dry out. Think about where you believe the damage comes from. Miles, gravel, mud, standing on concrete, kicking things you should not have kicked. That is the story everybody carries. And it is mostly false. The sole wears, certainly, and the sole is a consumable part that was always meant to be replaced. But the leather upper, the expensive part, the part that decides whether the boot lives or dies, is almost never killed by work. It is killed in the hours after the work by what happens while it dries. Every time you wear a boot hard, it takes on water. From outside if you are in wet ground, and from inside regardless, because a working foot puts out a surprising amount of moisture in a day. That water soaks into the leather, and on the way back out, it carries things with it. Then whatever you do next either saves that boot or shortens its life by a season, and most people do the single worst possible thing without ever knowing they made a choice. So what is leather actually? Leather is skin. That sounds obvious, and people still do not think about what it means. It is a dense mat of collagen fibers, millions of them, woven together in bundles. Flexibility comes from those fibers being able to slide past one another. Tanning does not stop that. Tanning stabilizes the fibers and then loads them with fats and oils, which the trade calls fat liquor, and the only job of that fat is to keep the fibers lubricated so they slide instead of grinding. Take the fat out, and the fibers stop sliding. They stick to each other, they abrade, and then the next time you bend your foot, they snap instead of moving. That is a crack. A crack in leather is not a scratch on the surface. It is fiber that has broken and will not knit back. You cannot condition it away, and no product on any shelf will undo it. Understand what one of those boots represented. A good pair of work boots in the middle of the 1950s ran somewhere around $10 or $12, and a farmhand's day was worth a few dollars. So a man was spending several days of his labor on his feet, once, and then expecting that decision to hold for 2 decades. A Resolé was a couple of dollars, which is why it was never a question whether to do it. That ratio is the thing to hold on to. He was not being frugal by buying cheap. He was being frugal by buying once and then refusing to let the thing die. And water takes the fat out. Every soaking pulls a little of it toward the surface and away with the evaporation. That is normal, that is manageable, and men have managed it for centuries. Salt makes it worse, and almost nobody accounts for it. Your sweat carries salt, and if you walk anywhere treated in winter, the road carries more. When the water evaporates, the salt stays behind inside the fibers. And salt does 2 things, both bad. It pulls moisture in and holds it where you do not want it, and the crystals themselves cut and abrade the fiber from the inside every time the boot flexes. That white tied line on the side of a winter boot is not a cosmetic problem. That is damage in progress, but the fat and the salt together are still survivable. What is not survivable is heat. I watched this happen side by side one winter, and it settled the question for me. Two pairs of the same boot, same brand, same day, both soaked through in the same wet field. One pair went by the wood stove overnight because that is what you do when you want dry boots by morning and you're tired. The other pair went in a cold back hallway with the laces pulled out and newspaper stuffed in the toes. The stove pair was dry by breakfast and they felt wonderful. They were also a half size tighter. The leather across the toe box had gone hard and slightly shiny, and by the end of that winter, there was a crack running across the flex point of both boots. The hallway pair took 2 days to dry and looked no different in the spring than they had in the fall. Same boots, same water, same weather. One night of difference. That is the number I want you to carry out of this. Not a temperature and not a product. One night. And notice what the stove pair did not do. They did not wear through anywhere. The tread on both pairs was nearly identical that spring. Because both had walked the same ground, the difference was entirely in the leather, and the leather never touched the ground at all. Whatever killed those boots was not underfoot. It was overnight in a warm room, with nobody watching. If this is already making you think about where your boots are sitting right now, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe, and turn the notification bell on while you're there. I put out one of these every week, the old practical knowledge that worked for 100 years and got quietly replaced with something you have to keep buying. The bell is the only way these reach you, then stay right here, because the next part is the one that saves the boots. Here is the second part, and it is the whole trick. You must never dry leather with heat. Not any heat. Not a little. Wet collagen is fragile in a way dry collagen is not. Soak leather and then warm it, and the fibers shrink and set, and once they have set, they are a harder, smaller material than the one you bought. It does not need to be anywhere near boiling. A wood stove, a radiator, a floor vent, a truck heater, a boot dryer on high, or the front of a campfire will all do it. So when you set wet boots by the stove because you want them dry by morning, you are not drying them. You are cooking them gently for 8 hours. Yeah, that stiffness in the toe is not the boot being tough. That is the damage. Slow is the whole answer. Room temperature, moving air, laces out, tongue open wide, something absorbent packed in the toes. Newspaper is what those men used, and it is still correct. A soaked boot takes a full day to dry, sometimes two, and that is exactly why those men owned two pairs and alternated them. It sounds like a luxury. It is the cheapest thing on this list. Two pairs worn on alternate days do not last twice as long as one. They last considerably longer because neither is ever forced to dry in a hurry, and neither is ever put on damp. One more piece and almost nobody knows it. Condition while the leather is still slightly damp. Not wet, not bone dry, that stage where it is cool to the touch. The fibers are open then and the dressing goes in. On bone dry leather, most of what you rub on sits on the surface and buffs off. Now let me tell you about the money because this part is not an accident. Turn a boot over and look where the sole meets the upper. On a boot built to last, there is a strip of leather running around the outside with a line of stitching through it. That is a welt. The upper is stitched to the welt, and the sole is stitched to the welt so a cobbler can cut the stitches, pull the worn sole off, and sew a new one on without ever touching the upper. That boot can be resoled 4 or 5 times. Now look at most boots sold today. No welt, no stitching, just a clean line where the sole is glued to the upper. That boot cannot be resoled in any way that makes sense. When the tread goes, the whole boot goes, and perfectly good leather goes into a landfill attached to a worn piece of rubber. Glued construction is not a scandal on its own. It is faster, cheaper, lighter, and for a lot of footwear, it is fine. But look at what followed. Once most boots could not be resoled, the work dried up and shoe repair shops closed across this country by the thousands. Once the shops were gone, whether a boot could be repaired stopped being a question anybody asked in a store. I am not telling you there is a room somewhere where men decided this. There is not. What happened is simpler and worse. It is a quiet agreement among everybody who profits to never point at the welt, because a boot that lasts 20 years is one sale instead of 6. Nobody has to coordinate. They only have to stay quiet, and they have for 50 years. Run the arithmetic. A welted boot runs a few $100s, and a Resolé is a fraction of that, 4 times across 20 years. Then price, a $100 glued boot replaced every 2 or 3 years across the same 20. The cheap road costs more. It just never asked for the money all at once. If that landed, hit like and subscribe and ring that bell. Now here's the third part, which is what you actually put on the leather. The old can on that shelf was usually Neat's foot oil, which is rendered from cattle feet and shin bones, or it was a blend of animal fat and beeswax. Fat to feed the fibers, wax to shed water. That is the entire job. Everything sold today is a variation on those two functions, and the fancy tin is mostly the same idea with better packaging. Use it thin. Thin coats worked in with your hands and let your hands do the warming rather than a heat gun or a hair dryer. Let it sit overnight and buff off whatever did not soak in, and use it rarely. This is where good intentions do more harm than neglect. Leather does not need conditioning on a schedule. It needs conditioning when it tells you it does, which looks like a dull, thirsty, slightly chalky surface and feels stiff rather than supple. In hard daily use, that might be monthly. For most people, it is a few times a year. Now, the warnings, because this is where I can save you a pair of boots. Do not overoil. An overloaded boot goes spongy, loses all its structure, and the leather stretches out of shape and never comes back. Worse, saturating oils travel into the stitching and can weaken the thread that is holding the whole boot together. If your boots feel greasy, floppy, or if the sole edge is starting to gap, you have overdone it. Stop and let them alone for a season. Do not use cooking oils, not olive, not vegetable, not corn. They will soften the leather in the short term and then go rancid inside it, and you will have a boot that smells and that draws mold. This is the most common bad advice on the internet, and it is the one that comes with a smell you cannot get out. Be careful with silicone and heavy waterproofing sprays. They seal the surface, which sounds like the goal, but a sealed boot cannot breathe and cannot absorb conditioner ever again. You have traded one wet season for the rest of the boot's life. Get the salt off before you condition. Sweat and road salt leave a white tide line, and salt crystals cut fibers from the inside and pull moisture in. Wipe the boot with a cloth dampened with water and a splash of vinegar. Let it dry slow, and then condition. If you oil over salt, you have sealed the problem in. Saddle soap is a cleaner, not a conditioner. It is alkaline, and people who use it every week are stripping their boots and wondering why they keep drying out. If your boots have a waterproof membrane in them, and most modern work boots do, check what the maker says before you load them with grease, because heavy oils can clog that membrane and end its usefulness, and one that has nothing to do with leather. If you wear a safety toe boot and it has taken a serious impact, replace it no matter how good the upper looks. A toe cap that has already absorbed one hit may not absorb the next one. That is not a leather question. That is your foot. Now, in two things people say every time I bring this up. The first is that none of this applies to modern boots because they are not made the way old ones were. Some of that is fair. Synthetics do not care what you do to them, and a fully synthetic boot is a different object. But the leather part of a leather boot is the same protein it has always been, tanned much the same way, and it fails for the same reason it failed in 1955. If there is leather on your foot, this applies. The second is that all this sounds like a lot of work for footwear. Add it up honestly, 90 seconds at the door and a conditioning 4 times a year. That takes 10 minutes. Call it an hour a year against boots that last 20 years instead of 3. Nobody in that farmhouse called it maintenance. They called it the last part of the job, the same way you put a tool back on the wall instead of leaving it in the field. So here is exactly what to do starting tonight. Buy a second pair and alternate days. If you take one thing from this video, take that one. It costs you nothing over time because both pairs last longer than one pair would. When you come in, knock the mud off while it is still wet and brush it because dried mud pulls moisture straight out of the leather as it sits. Pull the laces loose, open the tongue all the way, stuff the toes with newspaper and put them somewhere cool with air moving. Never by the stove, never on the vent, never in front of the fire. Give them a full day. When they are cool and just short of dry, put a thin coat of conditioner on, work it in with your fingers, pay attention to the flex point across the toe and the seam where the upper meets the sole, and leave them overnight. Rub a little wax along the welt and the seams. That is where water actually gets in, not through the middle of good leather. And watch the sole. Resole while there is still tread left over the welt stitching. Once the sole wears through far enough to chew up that welt, the cheap repair becomes an expensive one or an impossible one. Find a cobbler before you need one and ask what they charge. Most people are surprised. If you have gotten this far with me, hit like, subscribe, and turn on that bell. Nobody sponsors a video telling you to buy 1 pair of boots instead of 6. So the only thing keeping this in front of people is you. One more thing, because it is the part I actually remember. Boots had a life on that farm, and every stage had a name. A new pair started as the good boots, worn to town and to church. After the first Riesele, they became work boots. After the second, they were barn boots, and barn boots did the wet jobs nobody wanted. At the end, When the uppers finally cracked past saving, they went out by the back step for the 10 minutes a day when you just needed something on your feet to cross the yard. Nothing on that farm had one life. Everything moved down the ladder until it was gone. I asked my grandfather once why he spent so much on boots when the store had cheap ones. He said a cheap boot is not cheaper, it is only cheaper today. You did not forget this. Nobody taught you, and then you forgot. It was taken from you one glued sole at a time, one closed cobbler shop at a time, until you stood in front of a wall of boots, and it never occurred to you to turn one over and look for the stitching. So do one thing tonight. Pick up your boots and look at where the sole meets the upper. Then tell me in the comments what you found, what county you are in, and how old the oldest pair in your house is. I read everyone, and those stories are the reason I keep recording. And if this rang true to you, come back for the next one because I am going to show you how he kept a cast iron skillet slicker than any coated pan sold today, and the one common habit that quietly ruins a good one. Nobody sells it, so nobody teaches it. I will. Keep it simple, keep it yours. And remember, the people who bought one pair of boots and wore them 20 years knew things we are only starting to remember.